So this session is about engaging people from the African and Caribbean community in philanthropy. That isn't to say they're not already involved in philanthropy, but it's more about how we as a community of fundraisers and people who work in the not-for-profit sector can actually take a little bit of time to think about some useful approaches to engaging people in the community around the subject of philanthropy. And it is a distinct pleasure of mine, once again, to introduce somebody of very high standing indeed. I have to say, this is the best part of the day, when you get to introduce somebody who you greatly admire. Such is my real sort of interest in the work that Sharilyn does. Sharilyn, I'm sorry.
That's how important I am to him.
That's two. I did say three. And just so you know, on the third one, somebody comes with a really big stick with a hook on the end of it and yanks me off the stage. But Sharilyn Hale is a great friend of mine, and she and I have crossed paths more times than I care to number. I'm deeply envious of this woman. For a living, she gets to go to the Caribbean and engage communities on the subject of philanthropy. I've put my application in to be her PA. She's a very experienced fundraiser who has a lot to share on this whole area of engagement. She herself was raised in Barbados. Any Bajans in the house, by way of raising your hand?
Hi,
Two.
sister.
Two, great. Okay, enough from me, but it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Sharilyn Hale, who is going to share with us her insights, her understanding, and her wisdom on the whole subject of engagement. Sharilyn.
Thank you, Mide. So Mide and I are sharing this session, and when we were thinking about format and how to organize our time, we thought it might be useful for me to start with some framing remarks that would give some context to our work, and then Mide will take the next portion of the session and do a bit more specific conversation and engagement with you about more specific tactical approaches to fundraising and philanthropy. So just by a show of hands, who in the room would describe yourself as Caribbean or African in heritage? Okay. All right. I do not have African heritage, and nor was I born in the Caribbean. But as Mide mentioned, I did grow up, spend many of my growing up years in Barbados, where I completed high school before coming back to Canada. And in recent years, have had the real pleasure of doing a fair amount of work on a consulting basis, working with charities in both Bermuda and the Caribbean, particularly around their fund development and governance strategies, and working with them to build their organizational capacity. I've also had the enjoyment of spending some time in the professional fundraising community in East Africa, which was a real eye-opener for me. So I share that at the beginning because in some ways, what I'm sharing with you this morning, this afternoon, I feel like I'm telling someone else's story through the lens of my own story. And so I hope that I do that justice. And my Caribbean and African brothers and sisters will feel that I've done it justice at the end. I'm sure you will. Thank you. So we've already heard this today about diversity and diversity within diversity. And I'm quite sure in this room that we all know that Africa is not a country, it is a continent, right? And a very diverse continent. So over 50 different countries or nation states, population well over 1 billion, 3,000 languages. We barely manage effectively in Canada with 2 official languages. And certainly when I spent time in Africa, the dizzying diversity was quite extraordinary. And I think that's a very important context for our work as fundraisers here in Toronto and in Canada to have an appreciation of that. Africa is not one thing. Right? The same for the Caribbean. Depending on which definition you use, anywhere from 28 to over 30 countries, republics, nation states, population over 40 million. And certainly Africa and the Caribbean have that shared history of colonialism and oppression. And in the Caribbean, many of the countries have, in their history, changed many hands, from the British to the French to the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Spanish. And that intermingling of those cultures and that history certainly informs the culture today, not to mention the dreadful history of slavery and slaves from West Africa, and the Amerindian, the Aboriginal populations in the region. So a real melting pot, and as Africa is not one thing, the Caribbean is not one thing. What does that mean in the Canadian context, and then by extension to our fundraising? Certainly there have been waves of emigration from the Caribbean and Africa. When I was doing some research online, the first recorded black person in Canada was in 1603, and certainly in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, particularly the 1960s, when Canada changed their immigration laws to actually allow black people through the immigration system. Many people, particularly from the Caribbean, came to Canada at that time. Highly skilled, highly educated, as well as general laborers. And we see that today, and also see a very rich entrepreneurial class who've made their way here. So black Canadians, African Canadians, about the third largest visible minority in Canada, and of that, 85% are of Caribbean heritage. And would be interesting in the room if we did a poll when everyone was back to see if that was a similar breakdown in the room today. But as has been pointed out already, was it Syria? Lebanon, not everyone from the Caribbean is black, right? Very diverse populations. So Lebanese, Syrian, particularly in Trinidad, a very large entrepreneurial population of Syrians, South Asians, and in Africa also. Very diverse population. Think of the Ishmaeli community out of East Africa. And so for those of us who are not so familiar with the Caribbean or African communities, very important to have a perspective on that diversity. And in fact, the presence of African and Caribbean communities in Canada, I think, it impacts their notions of home, right, in terms of their experience in this country. So certainly for Black Canadians or African Canadians whose families have been here for many generations, their experience of Canada and being a Canadian may look very different than a first or second generation immigrant to Canada. Where they may have very strong ties to back home, which are much easier to maintain now than they were back in the day, now that we have Skype and internet and email and cheap airfares. So those connections to home, I think, are relevant as we as fundraisers start to think about strategy, because again, the context, as in all good fundraising, the context and the research needs to inform our strategy. And so understanding that sense of home and rootedness is very important. We've already learned the word Ubuntu today in terms of philanthropy, but I think the biggest learning for me in my travels over recent years, particularly within the nonprofit sector and the professional fundraising community, is that we do not have a corner on the philanthropic act or on philanthropy, and that it truly is a very human experience, that desire to help and to support each other and to give back, and it's evident in every part of the world. And I think that humility for those of us here in Canada is very important, regardless of the communities that we're reaching out to. We don't have all the answers. We don't have the market on giving, and part of our learning is to understand the cultural traditions of giving in other areas. Particularly in the Caribbean, you can imagine, so two words that I came across in some research that I've been doing on giving in the Caribbean is jollification, is one word, and ajupa, which I understood was Grenadian, but I just asked my good friend Jean, who's Grenadian, and she wasn't familiar with it. But what I came across in my research is that really strong connection to mutual dependence and cooperation. And you can imagine living on a very tiny island, surrounded by water, right? When crisis hits, there are not a lot of places to turn but to the people next door, right? And so when there's a hurricane, when your house burns down, when the main income earner in your home dies, right? The community really steps in together. And I think from a cultural point of view, certainly in the Caribbean, that type of interdependence and collaboration and care for each other is still very evident, certainly in the Caribbean and certainly within the Caribbean communities here in Toronto. So there are three themes that I've kind of stumbled across in my work that I thought may be useful to share with you. And in fact have already been mentioned today. So one is the role of family and extended family. We've heard that discussed a lot today. I've certainly seen both the experience and the expectation among families that you care for your family, you take care of them. And that may be as simple as, my auntie is paying for my school fees, or my uncle is helping send me to university so I can get my education. It could also be, my cousin wants to be an entrepreneur and start a business. And so the family members, the brothers and sisters and cousins will pool their money together to help their family member get that initiative off the ground. That is all very much a part of the understanding of giving and philanthropy. Faith and church, also have heard a lot about that today. In the Caribbean in particular, about 85% of people in the Caribbean identify themselves as Christian, although there is also a fair amount of religious diversity. And I suspect in Africa, correct me if I'm wrong, there would be even greater religious diversity, but the Christian church in particular, I think, is quite robust in many parts of Africa. And why that's important, I think, for a number of reasons. One, as we've heard, the church is the center of the community in many communities, both from a religious point of view, but also in terms of social service delivery, the delivery of some of those core services and needs in the community, which both require people participating in that church to give financially in terms of tithes and offerings, but also to volunteer and make sure that those things happen. From my vantage point, I think religious communities tend to provide an ethos. So not everyone of Caribbean or African heritage is religious, right? And I think it's very important for us as fundraisers to not make presumptions or stereotypes, but to understand that those religious frameworks that many of us have probably grown up with provide an ethos for how we approach giving and its role in our life. The third one, ambivalence about institutions. I had this on my slide, and I sought out the advice of some very good and close friends of mine who are Caribbean, because I wanted to touch on this, but I wanted to make sure that I was doing it in a thoughtful way. I've certainly seen evidence of this in my work in the Caribbean and as well as here in Canada. So if you think about the more formal institutions, particularly in the Caribbean, historically, they were the domain of the colonizers, right, and the people with power. And so for many in the community, they turned to their more informal associations and gatherings to make change happen, to support each other. And I think here in Canada, this series, a wonderful exception, I think many of our organizations have struggled to adequately represent diversity, not just by color of the people around the board table, but really seeped through the organization, right? And so the ambivalence about engaging with organizations, perhaps giving to organizations, is one that I completely understand. I think that organizations have also been ambivalent about diversity and how they can actually create that. And perhaps that's why some of you are here today, right? Because your organizations know you need to do something different. You're not quite sure what to do, so go to this workshop, right? But I think it creates a challenge for all of us as philanthropic leaders and fundraisers to think about things differently in our institutions. The purpose today is to make sure that we're all equipped to be more inclusive in our fund development practices, and I think tackling these issues is incredibly important. Specifically around the Caribbean and institutional giving, if you will, this is bared out in research. If you're not familiar with the World Giving Index, I highly recommend that you seek it out. It has some wonderful information. About 146 countries participate in this survey. I believe it's every year or every 2 years. And in 2012, 4 countries of the Caribbean were surveyed, and they explore 3 areas. One is financial giving to a charity, volunteering for a charity, or generalized helping a stranger, right? And the regional average for those 4 countries in the Caribbean was 35th of 146, with greatest emphasis on helping, general helping my family, helping my community, helping my neighbor. And so I think that that's something for us to pay attention to as we think about our strategy to engage people from Caribbean and African communities, thinking about what role can the community play in our strategies in terms of collaboration, bringing people together and using that as a way to engage donors. I was just in Barbados a couple months ago and heard a wonderful example. There was a very ill little girl. She had a very rare disease, and she couldn't get treatment in Barbados. And so people got together, they organized a cricket match, and people bought tickets to go to play cricket and to watch the cricket game, and they sold food, and they raised a lot of money to be able to get this girl to, believe she went to the US for treatment, right? When there's a need, people respond, right? But they do it in a way that resonates with them. And for me, that was a wonderful example of philanthropy in action. The other thing I thought may be useful, just to give some context, is, we all want to believe that our organization is the best and we deserve the most money, but there are a lot of other things that are vying for the dollars out of the pockets of people from the Caribbean and Africa, or from those communities. So I thought I would do a brief summary of what some of those things are. Communal savings systems. These have a very long history in both the Caribbean and in Africa, where people, family members or friends will pool their money on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, and then on a rotating cycle, someone gets the pot, right? And that pot is then used for a really important thing that the family needs, or someone needs to do a renovation in their house, or whatever the case may be. But saving is really important, and I think we can't deny the data in our own city about the income disparity, particularly among visible minorities and immigrants to Canada, who are often well underemployed relative to their skill level. So saving is a really important thing. Remittances. Statistics Canada tells us that certainly for first and second generation immigrants to Canada, they spend the most on remittances, which is money that they send back home to family. And I think in the Caribbean, it's about $1 billion a year between Canada, US, and the UK. So for those newer to Canada, you can probably safely presume that a fair amount of their budget is being allocated that way. Diaspora bonds. I think this is probably more common in Africa, although I've been seeing some interesting examples across the Caribbean. And this would be particularly for donors who are prospective donors who have greater capacity, financial capacity to give. They are on the radar of their home governments, right? And these diaspora bonds, the governments are going out to their diaspora seeking investment for back home. So that could be in schools, in roads, what have you. But while it may not fit our definition of charity as per CRA guidelines, it's absolutely in the context of community building and helping. And so that should be on our radar also. Regional NGOs are also looking to raise money from their diaspora, particularly in Toronto and in Canada. I would just spent a week in Trinidad a couple of weeks ago with the United Way Worldwide, and much of what they were talking about was how do we raise money from the diaspora to support our programs here. University of the West Indies, any UWI grads in the room? Okay. Have they asked you for money here in Toronto? No? We'll send your name and address to them. But they have done some great fundraising in Toronto with their events to raise money for the school and to send back. My own high school has an association here in Canada. And every year they have a dinner dance and raise money to send back to the school. And so when you're thinking about approaching prospects from any of these communities, and I presume the same is true for Africa. I forgive my comments being more focused on the Caribbean, but that's what I'm more familiar with. But very important for us as fundraisers to kind of understand that universe that our donor prospects are positioned within. So what does it all mean? So we've already talked about how giving is a very universal experience, a human experience. I think our organizations need to do a better job on valuing time and engagement just as much as they do money. And I know that's hard when budgets are tight and we have our fundraising goals to deliver. But I think to be authentic in our engagement with different types of communities, we need to model that in even how we talk about fundraising and philanthropy. A few years ago, for CFRE, I'm the past chair of the CFRE board. CFRE is the global credential for professional fundraisers. And a few years ago, I chaired a body of research that looked at fundraising practice across 8 countries. And one of the countries was Kenya. And the results of that research basically say that the principles of good and effective fundraising are pretty universal, right? So what will work in Africa in terms of principles, I'm not talking about actual tactic, but the principles of good and effective fundraising are as relevant in Kenya as they are in Canada and as they are in Grenada, right? And so to be successful in engaging new communities, you need to have that core body of knowledge. And of course, research. Research is foundational to all good fundraising. So if you have a particular donor, a major gift prospect, doing that research, not just on their affiliations and capacity, but doing some cultural research. Where are they from? What does that tell you about what may matter to them? Really important part of your work as a good fundraiser. Community building and collective action, we can't make assumptions that would resonate with everyone just because they're from the Caribbean or African heritage, but certainly that's a strong theme and something to consider. Make your case. Make your case. I can't remember which one of the panelists, but someone was up here and said, just because I'm from where I am doesn't mean or actually it was someone over here. Just because I'm from Jamaica doesn't mean I'm not interested in other things happening in Canada. I'm a Canadian and I want to be engaged. And so make your case. Don't make undue assumptions about what's important. I'm a white girl that was born in Canada. What does that tell you about me? Did you ever think, just looking at me, that I grew up in Barbados? Right? You wouldn't know that unless you engaged me and talked to me and have a relationship with me. Mide is a black guy that was born in Nigeria, right? That's not all he is, right? So we're all a whole universe, and we all our decision making is informed by many factors, and I think it's incredibly important as fundraisers that we have that sensitivity in our approach. As we work with philanthropists of all stripes. And lastly, my YMCA colleague already addressed this in great detail about building cultural competence and diversity. How many in the room have you heard have heard in your organizations, we can't have diversity on our board because we need people to raise money? Only Paulette Sr. and I have heard that in your organizations? We need fundraisers. We need people with money, and so therefore we can't find any diverse people, right? I'm surprised not more hands came up. Maybe you're being modest, but I think that is a real challenge in our sector, right? That the perception that only white people can be people with money and with power and with influence and affluence. Thank you. I was worried. Thank you. Well, I think that we do our sector and our organizations, and more particularly the fundraising profession, a real disservice when we don't have that frame of reference in our work, particularly for community organizations, particularly for social justice organizations, but not exclusively so. My opinion is that every organization in the nonprofit sector needs to be a social justice organization. And if you start from that framework, everything flows from there. That's all I got to say. Thank you. Oh, thank you. That's all I got to say about that. Now I have to say something else. So it's now my turn to introduce John. John Smith. No, Mide is a great friend and colleague, and I actually can't remember how we met. I just know that we've known each other for quite a while. And in fact, when I was in East Africa, it was the Kenyan Association of Fundraising Professionals, and I met a very tall man from Nigeria who turned out to be a very good friend of Mide's. And so for me, the lesson of that was just how wonderful a profession we work within, how global it is, and how much we share, right? We're talking about diversity today. We actually share so much more than we are different, and Mide's skill as a fundraiser is certainly a wonderful example of that. I'm actually going to read what's in the book here because he has many accomplishments, and I don't want to overlook them. Mide is Director of Leadership Philanthropy at Pathways to Education and has worked in the social impact arena with charities and NGOs for almost 20 years. He looks like a baby to me, but he possesses a unique global lens, indeed. He has supported the development of social impact programs, ranging from structural funding policy for the UK government to tackling dropout rates in Canada and supporting national and multinational corporations to achieve their social responsibility objectives. So welcome, Mide, and thank you.
We have a tremendous opportunity here in Canada because, quite frankly, we don't really know much about African and Caribbean philanthropy. There's very little research, very little anecdotal evidence, very few stories are coming out from our community about just how philanthropic we are. And so one could be forgiven for assuming that because there is such a dearth of information, that maybe not much is actually going on anyway. So all we have really are stories. And you heard Chief Umbulu's story. And there are many Africans in this room and in other breakout sessions, and people from the Caribbean too, who have their own wonderful stories about just how philanthropic they are, and just how philanthropic their friends and their circle are as well. So we need more research. We need more insight. That's one of the key ways that we're really going to increase our understanding, both about communities, but about how to engage those communities too. So a bit of a word from me. I actually am a very triangulated person. I was born in London, England, although it seems as though I was born in Nigeria because I talk about Nigeria a lot because I'm very excited about the country that my parents are from. And I've lived and spent time in that country. But I'm here in Canada and have been for 5 years. And that really, my story, is a testimony that I think is shared by many people from Africa and the Caribbean. We are from a multitude of backgrounds, as diverse as you can believe. I could not begin to start to explain to you philanthropy in our community. I really don't know anything about it. But I do have some stories. that I want to share. And we know that there are African and Caribbean philanthropists in our community. Some are celebrated. So, actually, what I wanted to do was to ask you how you liked my curta. You don't like it? No? Okay, round of applause for the curta, please. Now, if we were in Africa, we would call this a dashiki, such as my brother is wearing there. But in Nigeria, we like to mix it up just to confuse you a little bit. I'm actually wearing a curta that was handmade in India. Purely because, as a Nigerian, we love to rock Indian fashions. It's part of our culture. And so, as well as recognizing the beauty of our own clothing, we also recognize the beauty of clothing of people from other cultures. And we don't limit ourselves only to what we know. And that's a beautiful thing about African and Caribbean communities, our willingness to engage. I had 10 years ago, when I was working for the British Red Cross, the pleasure of meeting this wonderful man. His name is Wilfred Emmanuel Jones. And I had been in touch with Wilfred the day after I saw him on TV. There were two things that were extraordinary. The first, that a black guy was on TV. And the second, that actually he was an extremely successful businessman and marketer. And I thought, this guy could be great for the Red Cross. He could be a great ambassador. So I got on the phone, gave him a call, told him why I was so impressed with the TV program. And he invited me to the RAC Club in central London. And we sat and we spoke. And he said to me, so, hey, I know you like the program, but tell me a bit about yourself, which I did. And then he said, so what can I do for you? And I said, Wilfred, thank you very much for asking that question. I'm here today to represent the British Red Cross and to ask you for a gift of £10,000. And I was so glad he was sitting down because he just went pale when I asked him. And he said, wow, well, I'm impressed that you would think that I could make a gift of £10,000, but I don't think I can. So I said, okay, so how much can you afford? He said, well, since you asked, maybe $5,000. Wilfred was true to his word and sent through a check of £5,000. A few weeks after, I called Wilfred and I said, Wilfred, we have an event, and we would love for you to donate something to that event by way of an auction item. Have you got anything? Wilfred said to me, well, no, I haven't. But hold on a minute. One of my clients gave me a 2-week stay somewhere in the Caribbean. Do you think that would be useful? I said, yes. And true to his word, Wilfred sent through the holiday package. We auctioned that holiday package for £20,000 at our events. All the while, Wilfred is thinking that his maximum capacity as a philanthropic individual is £5,000. But he's just brought into our organization £25,000. Wilfred gave me a call one day. He said, Mide, I really need your help. I've been so inspired by the acts of giving. I want to set up my own foundation. Will you come and just give me some advice and have a discussion with me? Now, I was glad I was sitting down because I almost dropped. So we went, we had a talk, and he shared his vision. To cut a long story short, Wilfred markets himself as the black farmer. And he has a wonderful line of foods that actually are produced in his farm. And his idea was to take kids from the inner city who had never experienced rural countryside and bring them to his farm so they could get an idea and an experience of what it was like. Take them out of the urban concrete arena and bring them into the green, plush environment of a farm. And that program is hugely successful and has won many awards in the UK. All from a man from Jamaica, who thought the only thing that he could offer philanthropically at that time was £5,000. These stories need to be shared because they teach us a lot. They teach us about the importance of reaching out, having the courage to engage people who do not look like us, having a willingness and a passion for the causes that we represent, so that it is not about color, but it is about the idea of partnership and how we, as fundraisers or people from the fundraising community or the charity community, actually have a huge responsibility to make sure that we provide an opportunity for philanthropy to everybody. Are you all still with me? All in agreement? Fantastic. I'm a donor. I'm a fundraiser. So I get to see both sides. I often have a saying that the problem with fundraising is that we as fundraisers can take part in it without necessarily having to engage people who do not look like us. When it's about targets, we already have our audiences. The Seymour Schulichs, the Ivies. We spend a lot of time focusing on those people to the exclusion, as Norman said, to the people in communities that are beneath what can be seen above the water in the iceberg. And that has to change. Now, that doesn't apply to me, because I get to engage people all the time who don't look like me. But I do have a responsibility also to engage people who do look like me. The challenge that I find is that many organizations haven't yet clicked onto one thing. The people from the African continent and the Caribbean islands and country are not just beneficiaries of services. We are not just beneficiaries of services. We are not just people who hold a begging bowl. We are not just people who are poor. Our continent is not war-ravaged. Neither are our islands. There are 1 billion strong Africans in this world. They are successful billionaires, millionaires, doctors, lawyers, and they are actively involved and passionate about their continent, yes, but the world. We heard about Chief Mbulu. He has a program in Laos. Not Lagos, Laos. In the Far East, right? That's amazing. What would a Nigerian be doing in Laos? It's wonderful. We also like to play the role of benefactor. We like to give, and you've heard that 100 times already today. We are a people who give. We give, we give, we give. People, friends, colleagues, please ask. Ask and engage people from the African and Caribbean continent because they have so much to share, so many skills, so much knowledge, so much inspiration, so many stories, so many resources. And if we are not asking, then we're not doing our jobs. And remember, they are not beneficiaries. They are benefactors. And your marketing materials, your messaging, everything about your organization, we've heard it from the board to the staff, needs to actually reflect that you are a homely, safe, inviting place for somebody from Africa or the Caribbean to come and sit around your table, our table. So please ask. There's been quite a bit of a reference to this whole thing about, well, how do we get more diversity? And I have to say, I've been involved in that as well. I research and I understand those who are above the iceberg and I see them. It reminds me of somebody who has a fishing hook and just throws it into the sea and really doesn't know what they're going to catch, but hopes it's a big one. Surely we can be more targeted than that. Surely we can be more purposeful. So, there ends the lecture. I was trying to think about how because I move around a lot and my attention span is not what it used to be as I'm getting older. How do you sort of reflect philanthropy? How do you reflect engagement? And I was just playing around and I came across this and I want to share it with you. I don't even know where to begin with that. But I found it funny, and I hope you do too. I guess if I were really to stretch my imagination, it would be about taking that leap of faith, about trusting, about believing that we have a noble profession, which is called fundraising, or a noble responsibility to fundraise. And for that responsibility and that profession really to grow and to shine, we need to be creative and we need to take risks. Sometimes they don't pay off. Sometimes they do. So if we're going to really consider this whole issue of engagement, what do we need to consider? Culture is a big one. It's a huge subject, but culture is a big one. Chief Mbula and I are both from Nigeria, actually from different parts of Nigeria. He speaks a completely different language to the one that my parents speak. But we're from the same country. Africa is as much an Islamic continent as it is a Christian continent, as it is a traditional religion continent. So culture is a huge topic. I think the responsibility is for all of us to learn as much as we can and to have an expert by our side who can guide and advise us. One thing I know about Africans, and I think this also speaks for people from the Caribbean, is this whole idea of purpose-driven philanthropy. One of the things that I think a African or Caribbean philanthropist may be challenged by is the general fund. So you want me to give to a fund. What happens with my money? Who is accountable for it? How will I know that something has gone right? Will something go wrong? So the idea of purpose-driven philanthropy really is that when you are thinking about engaging people from Africa or the Caribbean, the story is really important. And how you will use those funds is vital. Because the general fund is a nebulous concept. Value for money. This is one of my favorites. I can't tell you the number of people either from the Asian continent or from the African continent who, when you sit down with them and talk about philanthropy, they are making calculations in about 4 or 5 different currencies, including the US dollar and the Canadian dollar. So the idea is that £100,000, for argument's sake, is about 25 million naira. Do you know what you can do with 25 million naira? And so we have to be able to translate value for money. We have to be able to speak in dollar terms and also speak in relational impact terms. Why is a $1,000 or a $10,000 gift useful? How many people will it impact? What are the points of leverage? These are really important issues. We've spoken about inclusion and representation. I won't repeat what has been said. And then, there is the what's in it for me. A lot of these societies in Africa and the Caribbean are patronage societies. That means that one hand washes the other. No surprises there. The Chinese community, the Jewish community, all have the same principle that one hand washes the other. Even the white community has that. And so one of the questions that we need to be able to ask is, what is it that we are actually offering? You're asking me not only for a donation, but are you actually also asking me to get involved? Will I have a seat at the table? Can I influence decisions that are being made in your organization? Will this open up the opportunity for me to network and meet other business people, other fundraisers, other lawyers, other doctors? There is always that component about what else, above my time commitment, above my financial commitment, what else can be offered? What else, in what other ways can I get involved? And that truly is the whole thing around time, talent, and treasure. When working with these communities, those three go hand in hand, almost always. So I want to close because we do want an opportunity to open the floor up to dialogue and to questions. But I thought that one of the things that may be useful is to just provide you with a snapshot of the organizations that are already out there in our community here, doing great and wonderful things, engaging people from the African and Caribbean communities, many of them driven and led by Africans and Caribbeans. So we do have resources. We do know where to find influential African and Caribbean people. The task at hand now is to engage them. I'm going to pause there. Any questions, thoughts, or comments? Thank you.